Jerusalem just may be one of history's most fought over cities. From the Crusades to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the city has seen a lot. Jerusalem is home to some of the holiest sites to the three Abrahamic faiths, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Western Wall, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. While the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has many different dimensions, control over Jerusalem has always been a really central and symbolic feature of it. And at the heart of the conflict over Jerusalem is the story of how Israeli occupation has expanded over the decades. Now, let's rewind a bit to 1947 when a United Nations Special Committee produced the first two-state solution, a plan to partition the British Mandate of Palestine, as it was known then, into Jewish and Arab states. While Britain's 1917 Balfour Declaration promising a homeland prompted migration to Palestine by a minority of European Jews, it was only after the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust that the United World Body decided to push ahead with the creation of a nation-state envisioned in the partition plan. The problem was, though, that there were already people living there, Palestinian Muslims and Christians. So the plan was to partition the land into one country for Palestinians and another for Jews, although Palestinians made up the majority of the population in the land. So who would Jerusalem, a city holy to Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike, belong to? Well, according to the international community, it would belong to the international community. Jerusalem, under the plan, was designated a special international status to be governed by the United Nations. And while that was the plan, that's not really how things panned out for the Holy City. When Israel declared itself a state in 1948, neighboring Arab armies declared war. It's been called the First Arab-Israeli War, or as Israel refers to it, the War of Independence. And the result? Israel captured land, a lot more land than the partition plan had given it. The UN partition had given 55% of territory to the Jewish state and 45% to the Arab state. And during the 1948 war, Israel gained control of 78% of the total territory. The remaining 22% made up the West Bank and Gaza, which was under the control of Jordan and Egypt, respectively. Jerusalem, in this process, by the way, became a divided city. West Jerusalem fell under Israeli control and East Jerusalem under Jordanian. This was because towards the end of the war, Jordanian and Israeli commanders Abdullah el-Tal and Moshe Dayan had drawn up a rough map of the land divided between them, laying the foundation for what we now call the Green Line, or the 1967 borders. And why the 1967 borders? Well, in 1967, tensions were at an all-time high between Israel and its neighbor Egypt, which had begun to mobilize troops along the border. Israel preemptively launched airstrikes against Egypt, totally catching the country off guard. And Egypt, led then by pan-Arab leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, mobilized Jordan and Syria to fight back. But the war didn't actually last very long. In fact, the Israeli name for the war is the Six-Day War, and Israel came out as victorious, and it captured even more land, including East Jerusalem. Israel claimed full sovereignty over the entirety of Jerusalem, and its administration of East Jerusalem is, under international law, considered an occupation. So when you hear the term 1967 borders in any discussion of a two-state solution, it refers to creating an Israeli state and a Palestinian state based on the armistice lines of the 1948 war. Now, despite international law considering Israeli administration of East Jerusalem an occupation, it hasn't stopped the government from taking further steps to entrench its control over the Holy City. In fact, in 1980, the Israeli Knesset passed the Jerusalem Law, in which it declared the now infamous line that Jerusalem, complete and united, is the capital of Israel. Now, the international community did not recognize the law, and despite Israel still considering Jerusalem its capital, not a single country has its embassy located in Jerusalem. Instead, you'll find them all in Tel Aviv, including the U.S. Embassy. Despite the close relationship between Israel and the United States, the official American position on Jerusalem by way of the State Department has been in line with international law. But even that hasn't stopped American politicians, including 3 presidents, from supporting Israel's claim to the entirety of Jerusalem. In 1995, U.S. Congress passed a law requiring that the American embassy be moved to Jerusalem. At the same time, the law also allowed the president to sign a waiver every 6 months to not move the embassy. And even though both President Bill Clinton and President George W. Bush made campaign promises to relocate the embassy to Jerusalem, they continued signing the waivers. And during his campaign, President Donald Trump made a very clear promise that he'd also relocate the embassy to Jerusalem, even though his own Secretary of State doesn't seem too excited about that prospect. In fact, even a lot of U.S. allies have warned against the move, since it would be a de facto recognition of Israel's claim to all of Jerusalem. But regardless of where embassies end up, the situation on the ground in Jerusalem isn't changing anytime soon, especially for Palestinians. Palestinians, both Muslims and Christians who live under Israeli administration, are not given Israeli citizenship. Instead, they're considered to be permanent residents, meaning they have the same status as other non-Jewish immigrants, even if their families have been there for generations, even if they were born and raised there. And that's a status that can be revoked, resulting in a loss of residency. And that move is part and parcel of a deliberate policy by Israel since 1967 to cement its grip on the city. The policy is also designed to prevent Jerusalem from being a part of any future Palestinian state. And another big part of this strategy has been building settlements in East Jerusalem in violation of international law. Those settlements, by the way, separate Palestinian parts of Jerusalem from the West Bank, a separation that's also marked by the building of the wall. So Jerusalem matters, not just for religious reasons, but because it is perhaps the strongest symbol at the heart of the occupation.